Would you please be seated? My name is Paul Foster, and I'm the head of the School of Divinity. On behalf of the University of Edinburgh and the School of Divinity, it gives me great pleasure to welcome visitors, students, colleagues, the family and friends of Professor Bond, and the head of college, Professor Dorothy Meal, to our opening lecture for the 2015-16 academic session. Special greetings to those watching the live broadcast. This event is also the inaugural lecture of Professor Helen Bond, who holds a personal chair in Christian origins. Shortly, I will invite Professor Meal to offer the formal introduction. However, I am going to take briefly the head of school's privilege and say to Helen how delighted I am personally, as are all your colleagues, to see you elevated to a professorship. You are an excellent colleague, an incredibly hard worker, and a good friend to all of us. What some of you here will not know is that Helen's recent article, dating the death of Jesus, was published in the premier New Testament journal and was the most downloaded article last year. Moreover, in my estimate, and without any doubt, that's not just because it is my estimate, Helen is simply the best New Testament scholar currently in post in the UK, and she has a global reputation as one of the sharpest minds in the field. Helen, thank you for your scholarship, your support, and your superlative friendship over the last 13 years that I have been here. I now call upon Professor Dorothy Meal, head of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, to formally introduce the inaugural lecture of Professor Helen Bond. Thank you.
Hello. Oh. Hello, can you hear me? Good. Well, I'd like to echo Paul's welcome, particularly to those of you who are newly arrived, whether staff or students in the School of Divinity, and also extend that really warm welcome to all the guests who are here today to help us congratulate Professor Helen Bond on the achievement of her personal chair. We're here to start the new academic year in some considerable style, because I'm certain that what we're going to have is a fascinating inaugural lecture, followed by a fitting celebration. And I'm particularly delighted that we have Helen's parents, her husband Keith, her children Katrina and Scott, her in-laws, family, friends here with us today. You're all very warmly welcomed. Helen first joined the community here at New College at the University of Edinburgh back in 2000 after completion of a first-class degree in biblical studies at St Andrews University and a PhD in New Testament at Durham University. In her time here, she's made some really outstanding contributions to the life of the school in her teaching, her research, and her leadership roles, as well as taking her considerable academic insights to a much broader audience through her very many media appearances. She's contributed to over 50 TV and radio documentaries and acted as historical consultant for both the BBC and the History Channel. Helen's research interests and expertise lie in exploring the historical, social, and religious context of first-century Israel. In particular, studying the historical Jesus and the movement that followed him, as well as uncovering more about other biblical characters and their afterlives. Her work on these topics has resulted in very many well-received publications. 3 books in particular: Pontius Pilate in History and Interpretation, published by Cambridge University Press in 1998, Caiaphas, Friend of Rome and Judge of Jesus, published by Westminster John Knox in 2004, and more recently, Jesus, A Guide for the Perplexed, published by Bloomsbury in 2012. And this joins very many academic articles and 2 edited collections, as well as another 2 coming out soon. As I said, all of these publications have been widely read and roundly praised by the academic and wider community. And as Paul said, her most recent article has been the most downloaded article in the prestigious journal New Testament Studies. Given just how well received Helen's work has been by both academic colleagues, students, and the wider public, I'm absolutely sure we're in for a treat with her lecture this afternoon. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Professor Helen Bond to the lectern to deliver her inaugural lecture entitled Paragon of Discipleship, or Parody of Kingship, Simon of Cyrene in Mark's Gospel. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, and thank you particularly to my friend and colleague Paul and Professor Meal too for such a lovely welcome. And thank you to everybody here. You can't give an inaugural lecture without a few people sitting in the audience. So thank you for coming, particularly friends, family, and everyone. And a hello too to people who knows where out in cyberspace. As Jesus makes his way to the cross in Mark's Gospel, we're introduced to a new character. Simon of Cyrene bursts into the narrative amidst a wealth of detail, carries Jesus' cross to the place of execution, and disappears as quickly as he appeared. The whole scene takes up just 1 verse, Mark 15:21, and is never referred to again. Over the years, church tradition has been sympathetic to Simon. At least from the time of origin in the 3rd century, he's been seen as a paragon of discipleship. His kindness towards Jesus was later remembered in the Stations of the Cross, shown here on the right and visible in nearly every Catholic church in the land. And Christian art and reflection have fondly remembered his act of service. More recently, Jesus films delight in the character of Simon, casting his actions as a brief moment of devotion in a generally bleak landscape. Cecil B. DeMille's King of Kings here, shown up on the top left, has Simon volunteer to help, urged on by this little small child here who says, "If I was a big strong man, I would help him." And Simon steps forward and decides that he will help him. Not only does Simon save Jesus from the Roman lash, but he takes his hand and lifts the cross with a smile. The words, "I will bear your cross, friend," are emblazoned across the screen, rather strangely attributed to Mark 15:21, which my copy of the relevant text doesn't say that. But then Cecil B. DeMille, I think, took a few, had his own version of the text. Similarly, in George Stevens' The Greatest Story Ever Told, the one on the bottom here, Simon volunteers to help and carries the cross alongside Jesus. As he watches the crucifixion, we see his tear-stained cheeks. And this film, too, is part of a long tradition of depicting Simon as a black man. Even when Simon is forced to carry Jesus' cross, as is the case in Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, an initially reluctant Simon can't help but be moved by the man he's forced to assist. And this positive assessment of Simon also runs into much modern scholarship, where Simon is seen as the first to take up his cross, often in contrast to the feckless 12 who have all conspicuously run away by this stage. Now, the homiletic value of these readings is clear. They serve a useful purpose in holding up Simon as someone who understands Jesus' teaching, an example for others to follow. But did Mark the evangelist intend Simon to be characterized in such a way? Put differently, does the rhetoric of the narrative at this point guide the interpreter towards a particularly positive assessment of Simon and his actions, or something else entirely? you may already have some suspicions that I'm going to argue for the something else entirely. My suggestion is that Simon does not function as an example of discipleship for Mark. That role belongs firmly to Jesus, the central character of the biography. And I want to argue that Simon's main function in the text is to highlight Jesus' kingship. First, though, I want to look at why the view of Simon as disciple par excellence has been so popular. Almost everything about Simon is uncertain. Is he Jewish or Gentile? Has he relocated to Jerusalem on a permanent basis? Or is he in the Holy City only for the Passover? Has he just come in from the country, that is, from his own country, from Cyrene, or from the field? You can actually translate the Greek both ways. And were either of these two activities acceptable on the day of Passover, which is the day on which Mark is setting all of this? Scholars have pondered all of these questions and have offered a range of possible answers. What's quite clear, though, is the fact that he carried Jesus' cross, his stauros in Greek, or more accurately, the crossbeam, the patibulum in Latin, which the condemned man himself would normally be compelled to drag to the place of execution. To some, Simon's actions here echo Jesus' words in 8:34, where Jesus declares to the crowd, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross," his stauros, "and follow me." These words are a graphic summary of Jesus' teaching on discipleship throughout the gospel, which has consistently stressed the need for self-sacrificial service, for those who are first to put themselves last, and for followers not to behave as others do. Cross-carrying, then, seems to epitomize what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, and to represent the ultimate way of following his example. It's hardly surprising, then, that many scholars praise Simon's action here, regarding him as an example of cross-bearing discipleship, and his service as a paradigmatic act. In a recent lengthy treatment, Brian K. Blount argues that Simon in Mark provides an illustrative example of a disciple doing as Jesus commanded in chapter 8, and that he functions as a worthy model of imitation in the Markan community. Some have gone even further, arguing that Simon... Oops, I should have shown you that already. Arguing that Simon was deliberately invented by the evangelist specifically to illustrate Mark 8:34, and to do what another Simon, Simon Peter, could not. Simon Peter, of course, has run away by this time, and so Simon of Cyrene, it's argued, is another Simon who steps in to do what Simon Peter should have been able to do. Narrative critics, who are particularly attentive to the gospel as story, have seen Simon's act as part of a wider pattern. In their seminal work, David Rhodes and Donald Mitchie argue that minor characters in Mark consistently exemplify the values of the rule of God. The actions of these characters become particularly prominent at the end of the gospel, where, in addition to Simon, we meet a number of other figures. The woman who anoints Jesus for burial, the centurion who confesses Jesus as Son of God, and Joseph of Arimathea, who courageously asks for the body of Jesus and gives him a decent burial. For the majority of literary critics, Simon and other minor characters take the place of the fearful and increasingly baffled disciples who have all abandoned Jesus, either at his arrest or shortly afterwards. Unlike the 12 disciples, though, these bit-part players instinctively understand what discipleship means, and so can be held up as examples to Mark's audience. So that, basically, is the case for seeing Simon as a disciple. There are, however, a number of difficulties with this interpretation. Most important is Mark's use of the Greek word angaruo, meaning to conscript or to press into service. Originally, this was a Persian term relating to the royal post, but by Roman times, it had come to denote the requisitioning of any kind of civil or military service, including carrying soldiers' packs and offering hospitality or supplies. The same word is used in Matthew 5:41, where it clearly refers to a hostile and unwelcome demand to render service to the governor's troops. There, of course, it reads, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles." And Jesus, of course, is talking about the occupying Roman troops. If they make you do something, do it twice as well, he says. So Mark's use of this word clearly suggests that Simon was forced to carry the cross by the Roman soldiers, and also implies, presumably, that it was not an arrangement about which he was particularly happy. It's difficult then to see Simon's actions as an example of voluntarily taking up the cross. And in further reference to that passage I showed you a moment ago, Mark 8:34, and at the risk of sounding slightly pedantic, but then biblical scholars often sound a little pedantic, we may also note that there is no indication that Simon has denied himself in any way, nor does he bear his own cross, despite, of course, later Gnostic interpretations which suggested that Simon himself was the one to end up on the cross. In the end, Mark 8:34 and the present passage share a number of key words, but the circumstances of Simon's actions seem far removed from the ideals of discipleship outlined earlier by Jesus. In a rather novel interpretation of Simon's actions, Gregory the Great in the late 6th century saw Simon as a negative example of someone whose outward actions were praiseworthy. He carried the cross, so he's doing what Jesus told him to do in Mark 8:34, but who lacked any real inner commitment. He was forced to do it. Few nowadays would derive quite the same morals from the story as Gregory did, but a reasonable number of interpreters do resist seeing Simon as a positive example, largely because of the element of compulsion in his story. So a number of commentators will raise the question of whether Simon serves as a positive example, only to reject it because he's forced to carry the cross. The reason for Simon's inclusion in the account for these scholars is not because Mark wanted to make a point about discipleship, but simply for historical reasons. Simon really had carried Jesus' cross. His name featured in the earliest Passion narratives, and his sons, Alexander and Rufus, were known to Mark's audience, and so could be called upon to verify the story. Hence, Simon's act was forever linked with the story of Jesus' execution. Now, I'm quite sympathetic to this view. I think there probably is some kind of a historical event behind this story, though I wouldn't be too optimistic about our chances of recovering it now. I also think it's likely that Alexander and Rufus were known to the gospel audience. Otherwise, I can't really see why Mark would mention them at all. But I also regard Mark as a highly skilled and creative author who doesn't simply add details because they were historical. My guess is that there's something more to the story than simply historical remembrance. And that brings me to my second odd feature of the narrative. Strangely enough, perhaps, narrative critics who champion the positive role of Simon here very rarely note that the Cyrenian is not the principal focus of attention, even in his own verse. He's clearly the subject of the subjunctive verb are, meaning to carry or to lift up. He lifts up, he carries Jesus' cross. But the prime movers in this scene are the Roman guards. the unspecified they of the opening words. They compelled, angarusin, those who mocked him in the previous paragraph and who will take him to Golgotha, offer him myrrhed wine, crucify him, and divide his clothing in the following scenes. The dominant verb throughout this whole section is crucify, stauroo in Greek. On your handouts, I've given you, it's really just the text, but I've emboldened the bits that have the dominant word there. So Mark 15:15, Pilate determines the sentence. He delivered him to be crucified, and the soldiers act on his order. Verse 20, they lead him out to crucify him. Verse 24, they crucify him. Verse 25, we're told it was the third hour when they crucified him. And in verse 27, they crucify a bandit on either side of Jesus. Thus, despite the wealth of detail surrounding Simon, his story is all but engulfed by the inexorable march of the executioners to Golgotha and by their relentless desire to crucify their prisoner. If Simon were being cast as an exemplary disciple, we might expect him to take on a bit more of an active role, perhaps to offer his services to the executioners, as indeed we've seen tends to be the case in the Jesus films. There, I think he has become more of a disciple. Other minor characters in the Passion narrative do take the initiative. So the anointing woman comes to Jesus and breaks her vase over his head. The centurion responds to what he has seen himself from his vantage point opposite the cross. And Joseph of Arimathea bravely confronts Pilate with his request for the body. In contrast, Simon's role simply forms part of a catalogue of actions perpetrated by the soldiers upon the now passive Jesus. And that leads me to our third and final curious feature of the narrative. The fact that Mark does not give any reason why Simon needs to be brought into the narrative at this point. Commentators overwhelmingly assume that the soldiers' brutal flogging in Mark 15:15 has left Jesus in such a weakened state that he cannot manage the crossbeam himself. This is also the way that Jesus' films always depict the scene. Such a reading fits nicely with the note that Jesus is brought, or even dragged, depending on how you translate it, by the soldiers to the place of execution, and his remarkably quick death, such that Pilate seems surprised later on. This interpretation also offers an easy way to harmonize Mark with the rather different account in John's Gospel, where Jesus carries his own cross with no assistance from Simon or anyone else. In fact, John 19:17 is quite adamant that Jesus carried his own cross. The resulting harmonized narrative would have Jesus managing on his own for a while, John's account, before weakness overcame him and Simon is forced to help, Mark's account. And so we can say that both accounts are correct. John refers to the first part of the journey and Mark to the second. This reading is not impossible. Mark's style is terse, and the evangelist may expect his audience to interpret Simon's help as a concession to Jesus' weakness. But what about the soldiers? Given their previous behavior, where they mock him in the barrack rooms, the soldiers would presumably not be acting out of pity or sympathy, but more likely from fear that their over-enthusiastic beating might extinguish the prisoner before Pilate's sentence could be carried out. Yet the point remains that Mark gives no hint of such motives, and we are by no means forced to accept this interpretation. A much more likely reading, however, in my opinion, would be one in which the conscription of Simon is seen as a hostile act. More specifically, an act of mockery perpetrated by the soldiers against Jesus. Two considerations, I think, bolster this view. First, the general narrative context. and second, Roman crucifixion in general. Oops. Ooh. There we go. Right, first of all then, the general narrative context. The whole narrative context of the Simon story has been dominated by mockery. Jesus is mocked as a false prophet immediately after the Jewish trial, sneered at by Pilate as king of the Jews, parodied by the soldiers as mock emperor, and lampooned on the cross by onlookers, the chief priests, and those crucified with him. Even the title on the cross, the King of the Jews, needs to be seen as part of this sustained mockery. Nor is there any indication that Jesus' executioners are relenting of their earlier behavior throughout these verses. The wine mixed with myrrh, which they give to Jesus to drink, is often interpreted as an act of clemency, offering an analgesic to deaden the pain. But this seems out of character with the jeering cohort that we met earlier in the barrack room. More importantly, a recent article by a biblical scholar, a botanist, and a doctor, must be right, has argued strongly, and to my mind persuasively, that this was part of the torture. Myrrh made the wine impossible to drink, and to offer it to a man suffering from excessive dehydration, as would be the case with someone recently flogged, could only be with the purpose of enhancing his suffering. The whole section then, from Mark 15:16 through to 27, from the mockery in the barracks through to the crucifixion, is dominated by themes of mockery, suffering, and cruelty. There is nothing here that would encourage us to look for clemency on the part of the soldiers, even if of a self-serving nature. In fact, it is the very bleakness of the scene which will make the centurion's later confession of Jesus as Son of God so striking. Historically, this mixture of gratuitous brutality and ridicule makes good sense. Conscripting another person to carry the crossbeam would have struck Mark's audience as unusual. And if they imagine Simon to be Jewish, his forced association with an execution on the day of Passover would no doubt be shocking. But these were people familiar with crucifixion in all its gory manifestations. They would know that the public nature of the cross was designed not only to act as a deterrent, but also to provide spectacle and even entertainment to the onlookers. In Martin Hengel's words, crucifixion was a punishment in which the caprice and sadism of the executioners were given full rein. And this is amply illustrated by the sources. Josephus talks of the jesting soldiers after the fall of Jerusalem who took out their hatred of the prisoners by nailing them to the crosses in different postures. Tacitus notes the derision that accompanied the crucifixion of Christians as punishment for the fire of Rome. And other writers comment on victims nailed through their private parts, hung on ridiculously high crosses to match their high social status, or crucified amidst theatrical shows. The mockery, of course, made the victim an object of ridicule and enhanced his humiliation and shame, thereby performing an important sociological function in creating a sense of distance between the crucified and the onlookers, and encouraging the crowd to identify with the upholders of justice, that is, the Romans. When the crucified was a brigand or a rebel leader, as in the case of Jesus, the mockery might be particularly severe, as the soldiers poked fun at his pretensions in a particularly grotesque way. When we analyse Mark 15:21 carefully then, we're left with a rather disturbing scene, in which Simon's involvement raises more questions than it answers. Who does he actually help? Jesus or the executioners? Would he be proud of his actions later, or ashamed of his part in the proceedings? And if Alexander and Rufus, his sons, were known in some way to Mark's audience, did they become Christians because of their father or despite him? Did they perhaps bear the shame of their father's involvement in Jesus' execution, rather like Paul did his earlier antagonism, or Peter his denial? Whatever the answers to these questions, Simon's role in the drama remains highly ambiguous. I propose that the reason why Simon's actions are hard to make sense of is because we're focusing on the wrong person. It's only when we direct our gaze onto Jesus, the subject of Mark's biography, that Simon's role begins to make sense. In order to appreciate this, we need a short detour into the genre of the gospel and its characterization of Jesus more generally. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a great deal of scholarly discussion about the genre of the Gospels. What kind of literature are these texts? Are they histories, or novels, or sermons? Gradually, it became apparent that the closest ancient model for the Gospels was the bios, or biography. Essentially, then, the Gospels are accounts of the life of Jesus. Like all genres, of course, bioi were fluid and wide-ranging, often pushing at the boundaries of generic constraint and exhibiting a variety of purposes and styles. What they all had in common, however, was a concern with the study of a man's character. As Richard Burridge notes, they aimed to establish the essence of an individual, and by doing so, to offer a moral paradigm for readers to emulate. They held up the lives of great men, and they nearly were always men, as inspirational examples of virtue, or occasionally dangerous examples of vice, in an effort to encourage appropriate ethical behavior amongst the audience. In effect, they said, first, here is the man and his way of life, and second, go and behave like him. This was particularly useful in the case of philosophers, where biographies had the ability to open up a personal connection with the philosopher and the would-be pupil, and to allow people to become disciples or followers without ever having met the great teacher. Although Mark's work would have struck pagan readers as rather unusual in several respects, his gospel does conform to this twofold pattern. The evangelist is interested both in exploring the identity of Jesus as the Christ, the Son of Man, the royal Son of God, and at the same time in establishing his central character as a model for others to emulate. The call to follow me is frequent in Mark's gospel, and discipleship is primarily through following the example of Jesus. In the central section of the narrative, Jesus makes a journey to Jerusalem, and it's here that he outlines the theory of discipleship, what it means for the first to be last, to deny oneself, to give up everything, and to take up one's cross. It's clear from these chapters that Jesus will die, a death that he views as a logical extension of the demands of discipleship. By chapter 13, it becomes clear that the followers of Jesus will also be handed over to councils, beaten in synagogues, and forced to stand before governors and kings for the sake of their beliefs. They will be betrayed by their closest friends and hated by all. But the Markan Jesus urges them to put their trust in the Holy Spirit and to stand firm. In view of chapter 13 and a number of other references in the Gospel, most scholars assume that Mark was written to a Christian group which had experienced some kind of persecution or feared that it might become the victim of Roman reprisals soon. In such a setting, it would be important to present Jesus not only predicting that such a suffering might be necessary, but also as a model for his anguished followers to emulate. And this is exactly what the evangelist does. In the Passion narrative, the theory of discipleship outlined in the central section becomes reality in a life lived to its very end according to the arduous and all-encompassing demands of the gospel. We're presented with a Jesus who, in a time of great distress, turns to the Father in prayer at Gethsemane, who is quickly reconciled to his impending death, and who is alert to the presence of evil at the hour of his arrest. We see him answer both the high priest and Pilate robustly, despite the danger of the situation. And we see his trust in God at the cross, even when the power of death threatens to overwhelm him, and God appears to be far from the narrative. The authoritative, powerful, witty Jesus of the first half of the gospel becomes increasingly passive in these final chapters. After Mark 15:2, he speaks no more until his final cry of abandonment on the cross. And the omniscient narrator no longer gives us an insight into his thoughts or feelings. As Jesus endures the depths of human despair, articulated through the language of Psalm 22, the audience can only imagine the horror of what he endures. Other characters in this tightly spun account act largely as foils to Jesus, to enhance his dignity and courage. Again, a common feature in biographical narrative. Most notable here are the 12 disciples, Jesus' most intimate, hand-picked men, who, despite their proximity to their master, are completely unable to follow him. The 12 are often judged harshly by modern critics, but I think this shouldn't be pushed too far. The evangelist wants to show that discipleship requires total commitment. And whether it's their lack of readiness in Gethsemane, their flight at the arrest, or Peter's denial in the high priest's courtyard, the primary function of the failure of the 12 is to highlight Jesus's unwavering resolution and obedience to God's will. Jesus goes to the cross alone, quite simply, because he is the only one able to do so. Only he can endure to the bitter end. Only he is able to face the terrifying power of evil. And only he will be raised again by God. At this stage in the narrative, no one else, not Peter, nor the rest of the 12, nor any other person, could follow his lead. The disappearance of the 12 from the Passion narrative, then, doesn't create a gap in discipleship which needs to be filled by minor characters. The focus throughout is on Jesus, the perfect example of a life of discipleship. Despite his interest in presenting Jesus as a model to be emulated, however, Mark has not set aside the question of Jesus' identity. Lying behind the mockery and derision of chapter 15 is a powerful irony. Jesus really is the King of the Jews, for those with eyes to see. The title King is used 6 times in chapter 15, and Jesus is mocked for his kingly pretensions 3 times, by Pilate, by soldiers, and by chief priests and scribes. Mark's paradoxical narrative points to the glory and dignity of Jesus, showing that the crucified Christ is indeed King of the Jews. What looked to an outsider to be the depths of suffering, humiliation, and even rejection was, in reality, the triumph of God's Son, a fact acknowledged, albeit unwittingly, by the centurion at the cross. When we put the focus back onto Jesus, the royal Son of God who dies as a model for followers, what does this do to the little scene with Simon? The details supplied by Mark identify Simon as an outsider, He's from Cyrene, the capital of North African province of Cyrenaica, modern Libya. The designation as certain, tis, suggests that he was previously an unknown character. And the fact that he's come in from the field or the country suggests that he's neither a follower nor an opponent of Jesus, but rather a neutral character who happens to be standing near the praetorium, or the Roman governor's headquarters. The reference to the fields, however, or country, however you translate that, recalls another procession, the much more joyful entry into Jerusalem in Mark 11, where those caught up in the drama cut leafy branches from the fields, again it's the same word, to line Jesus' path. Together, these two processions frame the Jerusalem narrative. The one leading into the city is full of joy and hope, looking towards the Davidic kingdom. The other, going out of the city, is an ignominious trudge to the cross, characterized by mockery and derision. And yet, there are a number of parallels between the two scenes, which are worth considering. Both processions start with conscription. In a relatively lengthy exchange at the start of chapter 11, Jesus assumes the role of an occupying ruler. He sends 2 disciples to go and get him a colt, which presumably he has no right to take. The lofty, "the Lord has need of it," may well mimic the hated practice of requisitioning, which will come to the fore again in the Simon narrative. Jesus' entry into the holy city, amidst the crowds strewing their garments before him and singing their acclamations, imitates the entrance processions of Greco-Roman kings and triumphal warriors, a feature which would have been well known to Mark's audience. Yet the evangelist quickly subverts any expectations his audience might have. Rather than claim his city, the kingly ruler simply leaves. And instead of inaugurating his rule through purging the temple, he returns the next day and announces its destruction. But none of this should be a surprise to the attentive reader of Mark 10:45. This is such an important passage, I think, in the Gospel that it's worth quoting in full. This is Jesus speaking to his disciples. "You know that those who are supposed to rule over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." For Mark, true kingly rule, both for Christ and for those who would imitate him, lies not in grand entries and important seats or lording it over people, but rather in service. As Hans Leander astutely observes, the Jerusalem entry scene is a parodic undermining of imperial notions of power. Everything is topsy-turvy, turned up on its head. Similar themes emerge in the second procession, in the trip to the cross. Once again, things start with the conscription scene, this time the story of Simon. Elements of kingship are much more muted in this second procession, but they're not entirely lacking, as we've seen already. T.E. Schmidt detects links to the Roman triumph in a number of apparently inconsequential details throughout the text. The gathering of the whole cohort, mimicking the assembly of the Praetorian Guard in Rome. The name Golgotha, where the mention of a skull evokes the Capitoline Hill in Rome. The refusal of myrrhed wine, aping the triumphator's refusal of wine and casting it upon the altar. And the placement of the central character between 2 others, lending the scene a sense of enthronement. Similar to the first procession, in this second procession to the cross, Mark parodies and subverts normal expectations. the mock triumph, ends not with the triumphator's victorious sacrifice, but with his own death. Once again, conventional ideas of power and kingship, even glory and shame, are turned on their heads. Together, both processions play with the idea of Roman power, destabilizing its meaning and putting in its place highly subversive ways of what it means to be king of the Jews. Simon's story, it seems to me, needs to be read as part of the soldier's mockery of the kingly pretender. He takes his place in a brutal burlesque of a kingly procession, which extends from Jesus' first appearance in the barracks all the way up to the place of execution. On the level of the narrative, the mocking soldiers put together a tableau in which Jesus, now we're told in his own clothes, is treated with mock respect. But what of Simon? How does he fit in? The role given to Simon, I suggest, is that of a lictor, an attendant who went before the magistrate, whether a consul, proconsul, praetor, or a lower dignitary. They all had their lictors. The lictor carried the fasces over his left shoulder, this thing here that you can see, which is a large double-headed axe bound to a bundle of rods. And this implement, this fasces, symbolized the magistrate's imperium or power. Originally, in ancient times, the king was preceded by a line of 12 lictors, as was the emperor in imperial times. Lower officials had fewer lictors, depending on their rank. The lictors went everywhere that the magistrates went, even wearing the same clothes as he did. Presumably, the idea is that they sort of magnify his presence. They kind of enhance his standing. And of course, the rods that they're carrying highlight his power. Only when the magistrate went to a house would the lictors part company with him, remaining outside with their fasces propped up against the wall as a symbol of his presence, rather like the flag being raised in a residence when the queen is staying there. So representations of lictors with their characteristic fasces are commonly found on coins and inscriptions and would have been a frequent sight in Roman cities. As M. Horster notes, during the empire, the fasces seem to have become such popular symbols of outstanding power. They were often presented in funerary reliefs of magistrates of the cities or municipal priests of the imperial cult, even if these men had lictors only on special occasions, or were not allowed to have as many lictors as were depicted on their funerary reliefs. So clearly people were very keen on sort of giving themselves more and more lictors in the hope of sort of enhancing their standing. So the point of all of this is that if you wanted to enhance your dignity and power in the Roman world, or that of somebody else, you present yourself as someone who has lictors. To show you this last one, if you're thinking from the other ones that the fasces looked rather thin and flimsy and not really very much like a crossbeam, here is a much larger one, which does look a little bit like a crossbeam. So clearly sometimes the fasces were really quite big. I just want to look at one further incident from the ancient world, which I think is instructive here. Writing around about 40 CE, Philo tells us of a visit of the Jewish king Agrippa I to the city of Alexandria. The passage is on your handout. Jews were unpopular in the city at this time, and the city mob had nothing but contempt for their king. So they expressed their feelings by seizing a man called Carabbas and taking him to the gymnasium, where they dressed him in mock kingly regalia and hailed him as King of the Jews. This whole episode, written, as I said, around about 40 CE, is highly reminiscent of Jesus' mockery by the soldiers in Mark 15. But what's of particular interest to us is that after Carabbas was dressed up as a mock king, the Alexandrian mob positioned two young men with rods over their shoulders on either side of him to act as attendants. The Greek word used here by Philo, charabdoi, is the very word used to denote the lictors fasces in Greek literature. So the whole passage suggests then that if you want to dress somebody up as a mock king in the Roman world, not only did you give him a crown, a robe, and give him homage, you might well give him a lictor too. Simon's crossbeam, I suggest, could have easily evoked the fasces. And the image of Simon going before Jesus in the procession might well have called to mind that of a lictor going before a high official. You may be objecting already that Mark does not specify the order in which the two men progressed, though I think the sentence structure does suggest that Simon took the lead. The tableau then created a sense of mock honor, authority, and power. From the point of view of the soldiers, it was a perfect way to lampoon the ridiculous claims of the would-be king of the Jews, and a natural manner to continue the mockery begun earlier in the chapter. The lictor, quite appropriately, takes his place when Jesus emerges into the public, outside the barracks. Read in this way, Simon is not a disciple. He is conscripted into the crucifixion scene to parade the helpless prisoner to his place of execution. He is part of the soldiers' brutal mockery, their spoof procession with the Jewish king to the cross. And yet, for those with eyes to see, he forms part of the triumphal procession, carrying the cross of the Son of God, the symbol of God's victory over the forces of evil. If this reading has any merit, it is not Simon who provides a model of discipleship for readers, as centuries of church and cultural tradition have tended to suggest, but Jesus himself, who goes to the cross in total obedience to the will of God. I chose to focus on Simon in this talk because most of my research over the last 2 decades has tended to concentrate on biblical characters. As has been said already, from Pilate to Caiaphas and Herod to Barabbas, even on Jesus himself. I never thought I'd work on Jesus, but finally I got round to it. I'm not naive enough to think that we can write biographies of these people. We simply don't know enough about them. My interest is rather in how biblical and other ancient authors use characters as actors in the plot, how they stand for certain ideas and assumptions, and how they're molded by contemporary concerns. I'm also interested in the literary afterlives of biblical characters, how their memory lives on, sometimes even today. Some require a certain amount of scholarly necromancy to bring them to life again. But others are with us all the time, acting as shorthand for certain character traits and actions. A quick trawl through the internet last week turned up a number of King Herods, for example. This was my favourite one. From Boris Johnson. King Herod actually turns up quite a lot in political discourse. It's like letting King Herod look after the nursery or whatever. Tony Blair, some of you may remember, was particularly interested in Pontius Pilate. He had a lot to say about Pontius Pilate. This is one of his many discussions. He commands our moral attention not because he is a bad man, but because he was so nearly a good man. One can imagine him agonizing, seeing that Jesus had done nothing wrong and wishing to release him. Just as easily, however, one can envisage his advisors telling him of the risks, warning him not to inflame public opinion. It is a timeless parable of political life. Tony Blair on Pilate, or is it himself? Judas, of course, is ubiquitous. This was one I found just last week from Joe, the website for British men, which I'm sure many of you are avid readers of. 5 Judases even Jesus couldn't forgive. Of course, Judas is commonly used in sporting discourse too. Judas also made it into an article from The Australian just last week, where Mary Magdalene, Judas, and Judas were seen as kind of representatives of redheads. I hadn't realized that. And here they are, along with Jessica Rabbit and Thelma and Louise. The figure of Jesus, of course, has particularly important resonances and has been invoked on a number of occasions recently in regard to another bearded JC. This one from the Daily Mash last week, courtesy of the Parvisses, and a particular favourite, this one I think is from the Mirror just a few days ago. Now, Simon of Cyrene is a tiny character, a bit part player in anyone's books. But he still lives on, not only in the artistic and religious representations I mentioned at the opening of this lecture, but also, of course, in the Cyrenian charity set up to help people in need. Sometimes these literary afterlives help us to see something more in the biblical text. Sometimes they're simply reflections of later times and values, but are no less interesting for that. I suspect that history has been too generous to Simon, but whether you accept my arguments or not, what I hope I've demonstrated today is that by focusing even on an obscure character, we can look at a familiar text from a slightly different angle, and that by doing so, we can open up new and original lines of investigation. Thank you.
Well, Professor Bond, thank you for an outstanding lecture. The content was magnificent. No necromancy there, just sure-footed exegesis. But I think more than the content, it exemplified for us why you're such a beloved teacher and such an outstanding scholar. So would you join me again congratulating Professor Bond? That is enough, otherwise she'll want a pay rise and we can't add it. We would like to invite you all to join us for a reception in the Rainy Hall afterwards. May I ask you to be upstanding for the academic procession, then please follow us out. Thank you.